And welcome back to the lunchroom. And I do believe we have Dr. Kenny Davis Anthony on air with us at this time. Good afternoon, Dr. Anthony.
Hi, Calix. I'm hearing you loud and clear, although this is a phone interview.
Indeed.
I'm not so sure that it's as good as the rail singer sitting next to you close to the console. But we'll see what happens.
I know. Unfortunately, thanks to COVID-19 and protocols, of course, we have had to engage in these types of interviews. But I'm sure we can hear you very clearly, and no doubt we will be very grateful to have you for the next 1 hour. And of course, I'm sure the time is going to fly by, so I'm not even too sure if you're going to be able to get in calls, but we'll see what happens nonetheless.
Sure. Okay.
Of course, you were, as one of the longest serving, I think the longest serving current parliamentarian in the St. Lucia Parliament, went through another session of...
I just 1 second, Calix. I suspect Philip and I would be the longest serving members of Parliament. We probably share about the same time.
About the same time.
Yes.
Although you do have a distinction, of course, of also serving in the Senate of St. Lucia prior to that.
Yes, way back in ’79. Then you're probably correct.
So I think we will still give you that title then.
You're probably correct, yes.
But of course, so you would have you've been through a number of different budget exercises, budget sessions, and of course seen number of estimates over your time. And of course you have been and presided over the Ministry of Finance as Minister for Finance for nearly 14 and a half years as well.
Right.
How do you characterize the last budget exercise which we have gone through last week?
Basically, I thought that this particular estimates of revenue and expenditure was a fantasy, really. I've never seen budget estimates of revenue and expenditure so detached from the reality of people's lives and the economic situation that we face. This really is extraordinary, and admittedly, it's estimates of expenditure, of revenue and expenditure, that is seeking to address a very difficult situation. Because, as I said in my contribution, St. Lucia is in a very deep hole. But the problem with it is that it lacks clarity and it lacks honesty. I think what has happened is that the government of St. Lucia is not really being honest with the people of St. Lucia to alert them to the real situation that they face. And I repeat what I said in the House, Calix, that whichever party that forms the next government, and I'm certainly expecting it to be the St. Lucia Labour Party, it will be a challenge to extricate St. Lucia from the mess that it is in. But that has seemed to be the historical lot of the Labour Party to do so. So it's a budget of fantasy. It's totally detached from the realities of our economic situation and the lives of ordinary people in this country.
And of course, as you mentioned, fantasy, this fantastical world, I can't help but think of the Wizard of Oz and the yellow brick road. We're seeing so many yellow brick roads perhaps being built all across the country right about now. And that seems to be the pathway that this current administration is taking, that they believe that they can somehow build their way to a new election victory.
That seems to be the plan, that seems to be the approach, and that seems to be the strategy. But you know what? This is one time the people of St. Lucia understand that the fundamental priority in the country should have been to look after the distress that has been unleashed in the country, their pain, and the real financial difficulties that they face. So you now have a situation where people can actually measure what is being done by way of rebuilding roads. By the way, some of the construction is exceedingly poor. I really don't know if people have seen some of the quality of the roads that are being built, because they're in great haste in any event, and some of the engineering is really abysmal. I can't understand why the Ministry of Infrastructure allows some of these roads to be built the way they have been.
And we're certainly seeing that in the Rodney Bay area right about now.
Yeah. But to return to what I'm saying, the people of St. Lucia are suffering. Thousands are unemployed. Thousands do not have access to any kind of income. Even those who are on the public assistance list, they're having a hard time. They're not getting their funds on time. People have a crisis in medical care. So the government policies are not touching the quality of life. The government really does not care about people. There's no compassion. And somehow they seem to feel that if they can dazzle the public of St. Lucia with these poorly designed roads and badly built roads, that somehow the people of St. Lucia will forgive them and say, well, listen, you did a great job on the roads and you deserve our vote. But I don't think that is the case. People are suffering, and people are suffering acutely and sharp. Everywhere I go throughout this country, Calix, I hear the same thing. It is difficult. It is impossible. We need help. And what amazes me is the way the government is so insensitive. They just they don't feel the pain and anguish of people at all, and they engage in a bureaucratic exercise that is so focused on constructing roads that they believe somehow that investment will allow people to forget the suffering, the pain, and the injury that they've had to endure these past few weeks.
I'm hearing a narrative from the St. Lucia Labour Party to the effect that there is developing two separate St. Lucias. One where we are seeing a few persons who are doing exceedingly well in this current pandemic environment, and another where there's an immense amount of hardship. How can we deal with that situation? I mean, how would it be different with under, let's say, a St. Lucia Labour Party administration?
I think the narrative is accurate. The government will go out of its way to secure financial assistance to foreign investors in this period. And more than that, they seem to be particularly interested in pushing the financial interests of particular investors. I mean, look at what's happening with construction activity in St. Lucia. It's only specific companies that are enjoying the largesse of the government and who are selected. I mean, this is crazy because even the procurement rules authorized by the Finance Act, the former Finance Act, and carried over into this new act that we have, was never intended to be used the way the government of St. Lucia is utilizing it. So what we have is a situation that a select minority that favor the United Workers' Party, foreign investors, and of course their friends and their lackeys, they are the ones that are reaping the benefits of the government's investment. But what is worse is the cost, Calix, at which that is coming, because a lot of that is built on loans, and some of them, as the government described, deferred loans, meaning that some of these contractors engage in construction activity, borrow money from the banks, and enter into agreements with the government that they be paid over a specified period of time. Incidentally, that hasn't changed the situation. These agreements are loans, and they should be brought to Parliament. And these investors need to understand that if problems arise down the road, then they cannot expect taxpayers to bail them out if these problems arise. Now, you're asking, well, what would the Labour Party do different? The Labour Party clearly has to look after the interests of the people of St. Lucia. And what are these interests right now? Persons who are unemployed are suffering. They need financial support. Every St. Lucian is facing monumental difficulty in being able to cope with day-to-day living. I mean, they're having monumental problems dealing with their commitments to the public utilities, whether it be the telephone companies or whether it be Lucelec. Some of the banks are helping, some are not. But more than that, those, for example, who are renting homes, they're not able to pay. I mean, the landlords are on their back, and no one is protecting them, or no one is saying to the landlords, look, we have to forego rent at this point in time, even if you may have commitment, but we have to forego rent so that, people could be assisted and we all begin to recover during a period of recovery. So people are really suffering. There are thousands who can't buy food to eat. They can't go to the supermarket. And this has exerted considerable pressure on parliamentarians and ordinary persons throughout the country, because those of us who look after people's welfare have to find resources and have to find means to assist the most distressed in the society. And this is taking several forms. But the government is not reaching out to anybody. The government is not using the resources to benefit anybody. Surely, if you're going to be taking a mountain of debt, and I believe that even the opposition understand that in this period of a COVID crisis, that given the fact that you have no resources, because your revenue has dropped so significantly, then it makes common sense that if you have any elbow room to borrow, that money should really be borrowed to look after the interests of the people of St. Lucia first and foremost. This is a time when we have to respond to the distress that is in the society, and this is not happening. And this is where I think the St. Lucia Labour Party will be different. It will put people first, and certainly it will attempt to cater to the needs of persons and seek to minimize the degree of pain and suffering that has been inflicted on the people of St. Lucia.
And of course, I'm thinking back to the time when you may have just won another election back in November the 28th of 2011. Coming into government at that time, you, of course, the country would have then faced the Hurricane Tomas and was in that period of just trying to get itself being rebuilt. And you had to, of course, deal with a lot of rising unemployment as well in that period.
Absolutely, Calix. And there have been some myths perpetrated by the United Workers' Party, and this is perhaps a good opportunity to debunk some of those myths. I mean, you recall that I inherited a very serious deficit, and that had to be tackled very early on. We had to introduce some measures, some of which may not have been popular with some people, but the reality was that we attempted to redress that by reaching out and providing assistance to persons. You will recall, for example, we created NICE to provide employment to individuals. And by the way, you had a UWP saying that the St. Lucia Labour Party deceived the electorate, promised jobs, and never delivered. That's not true. The fact of the matter is that we had agreed that we would spend $100 million on unemployment during that tenure. We called the elections 6 months earlier, you'll remember. And by that time, we had already spent somewhere between $80 and $85 million. So we were really on target. But at least we reached out, and there was nice. And the good thing is that we, towards the end of the term, we began to see signs of the turnaround in the economy. Unemployment again inching downwards. Gradually, tourism was picking up, investment was picking up, and you would have noticed that our key indicators had shown dramatic improvement. Even the growth the United Workers' Party claimed they enjoyed in 2017, they can't claim that growth. That growth came from the policies of the Labour Party in 2016 because the economy was well on the way to recovery. But the fact of the matter is that we were touching lives. I mean, the laptop program, for example. The Labour Party was very, very clear what the future held. And the Labour Party knew that textbooks would be a thing of the past. And we had prepared a new generation of children for the future, which meant that they had to get into technology. And a lot of education would have been conducted online by those methods. But what did you find? Unnecessary criticism of the initiative instead of embracing it. But the point is, we were touching people's lives, and for the first time, we were placing the poorer people in this country on an equal footing with the rest of the society, people in the middle class and, of course, the upper middle class. And you recall several other initiatives. We reached out, we recognized that there were a lot of parents who had genuine difficulty in preparing their children for education. And you remember, we reached out and provided them with checks of $500 each once their child had been admitted to a secondary school to help them in that kind of period. So we were touching lives, impacting lives. And people often say to me, well, what is your legacy? I mean, I don't want to debate legacy today, Calix, because there is so much to mention. But I think they understood that one big difference between the Labour Party that I led and the current regime is that we attempted to touch the lives, particularly of the poor, and give them the opportunity to be able to survive in the society that we had created. One of the tragedies, though, is that persons in St. Lucia did not understand that in order for us to build a society based on fairness, on justice, on equality, we did have to reach out to the poor to attend to their problems, alleviate the problems, to make them feel they were part and parcel of this society, and the society cared about them. And unfortunately, that philosophy, that logic was never understood. That's why, for example, Calix, we had programs like PROUD, seeking to empower people by granting them access to land at exceedingly reasonable cost. So we were engaged in a rebalancing act, and of course, electorally, I was punished for it because people didn't understand. But the point is, when you ask people today, which government in recent years has really attempted to deal with poverty and the situation confronting people who are poor, they will tell you it's the Kenny Anthony-led administration because of the investment we made to ensure that these individuals felt that they were part of the society and the society cared for them as well.
Do you think sometimes there is objection to equity in a society? Do you think that sometimes even persons who may have, they themselves may have come from poor backgrounds, have made it into the middle class, sometimes, take objection to, support for persons who still have not made it out? And I want to raise one example of that, the issue of universal secondary education. I think about 9 schools were built in 9 years to achieve a space for every child leaving a primary school, going into secondary school. But you heard quite a lot of individuals coming out and saying that USC was bad.
Yeah, absolutely, Calix. I mean, there are people in this country who do not understand the necessity of fairness and equity. And it is very sad because some of those individuals, as you rightly said, Calix, they themselves emerged from the working class, from the poorer sections of the society. I mean, I know business people, for example, who had their origins in the working class from poor families, but once, of course, they have climbed the upper echelons and they are part and parcel of the of the businesses, and they have seemingly arrived at the top. They then completely forget what their pasts were. And there are several businesses, obviously, it's been videos of me to mention names because I've had personal experience. But some of it, of course, is really misunderstanding, too, that some do feel that something is wrong in extending support and assistance because they feel that this is largest for political reasons, that they don't understand that there are certain persons in the society who simply are not empowered, and you don't have a system that allows you the flexibility to create different opportunities for them. I mean, there's a whole generation of solutions, Calix, who never benefited from secondary education, who never ever had access to skills training, and who live very ordinary lives, but they too require an income. They need a decent home as well. They need to send their children to school. And hence the Labour Party would have created something like a STEP program to attend to the needs of these individuals, knowing full well that they didn't have the kind of skills
and an NSDC as well
to enter into the labor market. Now, the tragedy is that people did not understand this philosophy of social rebalancing and social readjustment, and they thought all of this was just bare handouts, and therefore that you ought not to grant or make any handouts to these individuals. Instead, you have to adopt a different approach, as this regime currently adopts. This regime, for example, tells you that people don't require assistance, and they actually make it an issue. It's, I mean, to give you an example, Calix, they do not accept the philosophy that in these COVID times that we have to extend a helping hand, whether it be to small businesses or to ordinary individuals or to those who are in distress. I remember at a sitting of Parliament, not this one, the one before, I was saying that there's nothing indecent about extending a helping hand to persons in distress. Look at the situation in the United States and Europe. Now, clearly, it's not the same because these countries have resources which we don't, and we do have to be very careful with resources. But millions of dollars are made available in additional financing and funding to the distress. I mean, you just watch what Biden did in the U.S. The contention of the St. Lucia Labour Party is this: if you're going to borrow that money to attend to the needs of individuals, to assist them. And this government, for example, is not even making a statement to the, let us say, the public utilities, or to the banks, or to the landlords, say to them, look, these are difficult times. People need help. Can you restrain yourself? Provide a modicum of support at this time, because we all have to go through the same thing. They don't understand the necessity of that. They don't understand that culture. And, I mean, this is not a government that understands compassion. They don't understand caring. They don't know how to reach out. And that's the tragedy of our situation. And that is why the people of St. Lucia are telling you, look, we don't need the expenditure in the roads that you're engaged in. What we need simply is help.
But Dr. Anthony, you said that they don't care, but is it that they don't care about certain people, or is it that because we are seeing a lot of support being provided to certain businesses, we are seeing a lot of support provided to certain quote-unquote investors or developers. We've just seen, of course, this whole debacle of the Cabot loan coming out of the NIC. So it seems as if resources are being found for certain types of people.
Absolutely. And the government, the mistake the government is making, Calix, is that they feel somehow if they push road construction and make public monies available to these individuals, somehow the benefits of that are going to percolate into the economy, give the economy growth, and at the same time rescue St. Lucia. The reality is that we are in an exceedingly deep hole. And if, of course, you can't reach out to provide support to individuals, then what you're doing is really to condemning them until such time that a growth occurs. So people are going to live in limbo in the circumstances that we are for some years to come because their needs are not being attended to. And you're absolutely correct. The government has decided that if there is any sector to benefit and to be given resources, are their friends, the foreigners, as well as certain businesses in the country and certain construction firms. And the rest of the people of our country, the rest of our constituents must make do as they can and wait for the economic turnaround, which they hope that these projects would, of course, facilitate in the months and weeks ahead.
And of course, the issue of growth, I mean, we look at these figures sometimes, the GDP has gone up by so much, but it doesn't really tell the full story. It certainly does not explain the quality of that growth. I mean, so we're looking at right now, for instance, growth in the construction sector, which is 98% dominated by males. And the current unemployment increase is more disproportionately affecting females. So
absolutely, yeah. And then Calix, a country can experience growth, and I'm not admitting right now that we're in a cycle of growth in this country. The harsh reality is that GDP growth has fallen dramatically in St. Lucia. The government is wrestling with right now wrestling with the extent of the decline in growth, hence this dispute as to whether growth is 18%, 22%,
or 26%, I think,
or 26 or 25%. And hence this disagreement with the central bank over the growth statistics. But growth can occur in a society that is, as you know, deeply segmented, a society in which the class structure is deeply entrenched, a society in which there's a huge gap between the haves and the have-nots. What the Labour Party had been attempting to do during my tenure was, of course, to try to close that gap by providing resources to the poorer sections of the society to empower them to begin to contribute in a productive way to the economic fortunes of the country. The government doesn't see it that way. The government sees the thing in a different way. But you're absolutely correct that sometimes growth hides inequalities in the society. So you can talk about an 8% growth or a 10% growth, but it has little impact on the poorer sections of the society, on the working class, and on the distressed. In fact, until the Labour Party came into office in 1997, this basically was the pattern. That is why we introduced programs like the Poverty Reduction Fund to begin to provide people with infrastructure in their communities to lift them from the distress in which they live. That is why we pursued universal secondary education. So you're absolutely correct. You can't judge an economy or a society by its growth. What you have to do is to have a look at the structure of the society and where the income generated by the growth is going. And you can get a situation where you have an upper end. They're extremely rich, well endowed, but the vast majority of the people of the country are living in poverty and living in distress. What has happened in St. Lucia now is that the dichotomy between the rich and the poor has become even more sharp.
That wealth gap is increasing.
Real. That's the reality that we face.
In fact, just today I was hearing a friend of mine who's a banker, investment banker, indicating that there's actually been a lot of interest among certain people who actually are looking to invest more, and so there seems to be some liquidity for some, but it certainly is not across the board. It's not being
absolutely
shared equally.
Yeah.
Dr. Anthony, we saw, of course, when you came in back in 2011, at that time, the country was facing, as you said, a significant fiscal deficit. And in addition to that, the debt to GDP of the country was increasing at a very large rate because of that fiscal deficit.
That's right.
And at that time, of course, I think you were looking at maybe about 75% in terms of what you knew at that time. Now, those figures have been rebased. Twice, indeed. And in fact, at the time when you were there, the truth was that the debt to GDP was closer to, I think, about 59%, interestingly enough. But of course, you didn't have that benefit of knowing that at that time because you didn't have the benefit of those figures. We have now seen this government come in, and it appears that they believe that this lower debt to GDP is a sort of a signal to borrow more. And I think we're looking at somewhere around nearly $2 billion worth of committed borrowing at this time. Are you concerned that this current pattern, although it hasn't as yet impacted on our full debt stock, are you concerned looking forward that we may be facing potentially an intervention by the International Monetary Fund?
Calix, what I can confirm and what is my own personal view is that St. Lucia will have an issue to extricate itself from debt, and that will happen very soon, that it is not far away. Now, I think it is fair to say, and let me just put that aside, that in this COVID crisis, in this COVID pandemic, it is expected that governments would borrow. In fact, international institutions have conceded that there must be some leeway. The problem with St. Lucia is what the money has been borrowed for. Because the money has not been borrowed to really impact healthcare. I mean, you just have to look around how we've been handling this COVID crisis. Our reputation has taken a serious blow. We are the worst performing state now in handling COVID in the Eastern Caribbean. The debt was meant to extend support to the people of the country to deal with the issues that they face with unemployment, with obtaining the basic necessities of life, etc. But that is not the case. The money is being borrowed to facilitate particular investors and to engage in particular activities totally removed from the daily experiences of people's lives. Now let us go back to the debt, Calix, and the point that you made. When you look at the history of the Labour Party during the last 10 years, because of the policies that we engaged in to try to reduce the deficit, and I'm happy to say that when I left office, we had in fact done something that was extraordinary, reduced that deficit just to about 3.3 or 3.4%. And we had surprised a number of institutions that we were able to do so. So they inherited an economy that had begun to show or exhibit the signs of readjustment, and an economy that was on an upward path. That's what he had. He really had an economy that had a fairly sound footing. Now, the statistics will always also show that the trend to borrowing was actually declining gradually. That we were borrowing, yes, of course we were, but not at a rate as before, or certainly not at the rate as the current government. So this government comes in, they decide to go to town on borrowing, they decide to redeem their political fortunes by borrowing as much as possible, to see if they can dazzle people with infrastructure. But the harsh, cold reality is that there are going to be problems in the future. A lot of St. Lucia's debt, by the way, is owed to the regional government securities market within the region. And that is going to be problematic because you're constantly rolling over that debt. And at some point, I think those who are holding your instrument will say, whoa, what is happening? Your debt to GDP ratio has climbed, and now what is your capacity to be able to deal with that debt? This big fuss that the government is making that the debt to GDP ratio is not 102%, and forget the Caribbean Development Bank, forget they claim that it was an error. They didn't use market prices instead of constant prices. I mean, it's just crazy that an institution like that could make a mistake like that. I mean, it's not believable. I've never heard that kind of thing before. And something must be chronically wrong at CDB for that kind of thing to happen. But put that aside for the time being. By the time this financial year ends, if indeed your debt to GDP ratio is about 87%, you can rest assured it'll be close to 100 because, as you know, your debt is normally measured by the quantum of disbursed debt. So at the end of the day, given this year, and what is likely to happen this year, you're going to be climbing very easily in the 90s and certainly well over 95, assuming that they are correct and the figures are not hidden. Then there's a tricky issue. The fact is that the government had alternatives. There was no need to borrow $670 million to build an airport terminal because there was an approach by way of a private sector investment. And, of course, I don't want to get involved in that at the moment and the complexities because you have dealt with that. But that kind of debt portfolio could have been minimized. And whether the government jumps high or jumps low, that quantum of debt has to be included in the debt stock currently in the country. So we are now embracing policies that are not sustainable. We are embracing policies that cannot facilitate our growth in a balanced way, and in fact what we are doing, to use someone else's terms, we engage in flashing mirrors, creating an illusion. We are creating a false economy. That's what's happening in St. Lucia right now, where certain kinds of activities are being used to judge the economy. But the fundamentals of the St. Lucian economy has now been torn asunder, and I think that's going to be the challenge for the future.
Right, indeed. And Dr. Anthony, we're going to have to take a short break at this time because we have the weather news. So we'll be back just after this. And when I come back, I hope we can get into this issue of the St. Jude Hospital reconstruction project, which of course is something very dear to your heart, I know.
Absolutely, sure.
And welcome back to the lunchroom, and we are speaking with the former Prime Minister and Member of Parliament for Vieux-Fort South. He is Dr. Kenny D. Anthony, and we're discussing the estimates of revenue and expenditure for 2021, 2022, what might very well be called a yellow brick road budget of sorts. Dr. Anthony, we were, of course, hoping to move across to the whole issue of St. Jude Hospital, but before I do that, somebody in the chat group on the Facebook chat raised this question that he says he keeps hearing the UWP saying the SLP under Dr. Kenny Anthony couldn't have borrowed any money for the places that they are borrowing now. Or in other words, that I think that the government is saying that they can borrow money now, but you were not able to borrow money before.
That is absolute crap. Absolute crap. And they're basing that, Calix, on a comment that I made that there was a period we could not borrow because, not that we could not borrow, sorry, there was a period when the appetite for St. Lucian government instruments or the regional government securities market was high. And that was easily traceable to the high fiscal deficit that we had.
And the debt to GDP ratio at the time.
And the debt to GDP ratio at the time, so which we had to deal with. And the way to deal with it, and the way we dealt with it, first of all, was to reduce the fiscal deficit, which we reduced, as I mentioned to you, from a 10% down to about 3.3 or 3.4.
I think it's even lower than that, actually. I just looked at it. It's 1.5%. It went out as low as in 2016.
Yeah. Because if we were able to achieve that, and I suspect you're reading from the rebase figures as well.
On the rebase figures from the 2019.
If we were able to achieve that, then that would be a remarkable feat by a Minister of Finance.
Yeah.
I mean, totally remarkable. I mean, I'm not giving any praise for it. I have never sought praise for it. But very few ministers of finance could have achieved that.
It's on page 47 of the Social and Economic Review. There's a very lovely table there that showed it moved from 7.5% down to about 1.5%.
Well, I mean, that is incredible, Calix. Now, it meant, therefore, that once we had engaged in the readjustment that was necessary, brought in VAT, reduced the deficit, brought revenue, closer balance between revenue and expenditure. St. Lucia's debt portfolio became healthy again. And you will notice that by 2015, 2016, the appetite for the instruments of the government of St. Lucia had returned because we were able to deal with the fundamentals. The reality of the current situation of this government is that we have a pandemic on our hands, and a lot of international institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, have extended a helping hand to St. Lucia. I mean, the World Bank, for example, never interfered with our borrowing. As a matter of fact, there's a project that the UWP is benefiting from now.
The DVRP.
DVRP, which was a project designed by the St. Lucia Labour Party.
I think it was the single largest loan ever.
Ever given to a government. And this was almost unheard of. And we were, in fact, seen as pioneers for the rest of the Caribbean. So there was never that kind of issue. The issue was really the appetite for government instruments under our GSM. So that is really the blatant falsehood. The other thing is this, Calix, and it has to enter the equation. Whether we like it or not, never before has the island of St. Lucia owed a particular government as much money as we do now. we never ever milked the Taiwanese government for loans. The only loan we took from the Taiwanese government was, I think, the 20 or 25 million US. I can't remember. I think
20 million US, yeah.
Yeah, 20 million US for the St. Jude Hospital. But what has been a history of this government? This government has borrowed millions, hundreds of millions of dollars from the government of Taiwan. And all of this, of course, has to do with a dedicated issue of retaining Taiwan as a diplomatic ally. That's really what the issue is about. It's really issues about our sovereignty. So I don't know what they're talking about. And, of course, whatever they have borrowed has come from an environment right now in which it is more receptive to on lend because of the monumental problems we face in respect of the COVID pandemic. I mean, the IMF has said so, the World Bank has said so, CDB has said so. So all the multilateral institutions have done away with their traditional
prudential limits.
Limits to extend support to all of the governments, including the government of St. Lucia. So I don't know what they're talking about, and it's utter nonsense to suggest you don't judge a government by its capacity to borrow. You judge a government by its ability to attract investment. And certainly you
and perhaps borrow less, in fact.
Yes. And you can't pay for people's investment as this government is doing. This government is paying for investors to get involved in this country. That's what the Cabot thing was all about.
Right.
When they borrowed, of course, money from NIC, what we were doing was to take our pensioners' money and lend, of course, to an investor, albeit in the initial phases of his investment. I mean, this doesn't happen anywhere else.
And of course,
what has happened here.
And of course, you have quite a number of those types of quote-unquote investments in VA4 South, the DSH project.
Of course. You know, focus and emphasis. I mean, we're talking about the Ojo Labs and the Intel IB or whatever it is. I can't quite remember the name.
ITEL BPO, yes.
And you know that they have never had a decency to invite me as parliamentary representative to visit what they're doing. It's a bit too late for that right now, but it's interesting. And the most dangerous thing that could happen in any country is where investors adopt a political preference and a political approach to their investment. No investor should do that. And to the credit of the people of St. Lucia, I have seen those investors who have declared their political hands and political preferences, and St. Lucians have been saying, look, we've had enough of that kind of approach. We don't need that kind of approach. That's unfortunate what has happened.
Very, very interesting and instructive. But Dr. Anthony, we don't have very much time, and I do want to touch on the issue of St. Jude Hospital.
Yes, please.
I mean, your government, of course, was excoriated over the issue of not being able to complete or commission the St. Jude Hospital, which, of course, you had inherited from a previous administration, the King administration in 2011. And, of course, we've now seen an entirely new direction taken with that project, a brand new structure now going up, more steel and concrete to be poured, and lots more money to be spent. I'm not sure that we even know the current cost of St. Jude.
They're not admitting it, that's right.
They're not, exactly. And so we're seeing this project unravel. And in this year's estimates, very interestingly enough, only $12 million being put forward to this project, which is supposed to be delivered before the next general election.
You know, it baffles me that the UWP government believes it has continued legitimacy to attack the Labour Party. First of all, it's clear that they can't deliver the hospital before the general elections. They can't. I mean, the hospital is far away from completion. The second interesting thing, Calix, it's their approach to the whole planning issue. And I want to go back there for a moment, and let's revisit. Because you remember, they condemned the Labour Party, allegedly because the Labour Party was constructing a building without plans. And I have much more to say, and I'm going to come on a second point in a few minutes. The St. Jude application, as we know, was approved with conditions attached. One, professional indemnity insurance for the development. Secondly, fire approval, health approval, and the usual approval for what developers call MEP, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing. And it was a requirement that mechanical drawings have to be certified by a locally registered mechanical engineer. Electrical drawings to be certified by a registered electrical engineer. Now, the question is, and amazingly, to date, none of these documents have been submitted to the DCA. In order for the DCA to have a copy on the office copy file, in the event of any judicial review or any legal matter regarding the construction of the hospital. These are supposed to be public documents. And concerning the professional indemnity insurance, this had to be done since the developer and designer, FDL, did not provide architectural certified drawings. This has never been done for any commercial development in St. Lucia. It's the first. Architectural certification is a must for submission as a submission requirement as engineering, electrical, mechanical, fire, health, etc. So we have a building that is being constructed without the DCA, having seen or received the requirements, which are very important, especially for the hospital. The question is, why has the DCA not taken this matter very seriously? And I'm beginning to think, colleagues, that the DCA is actually afraid of, it's not only complicit, but I'm beginning to think they're afraid of Guy Joseph. I mean, this is crazy. These are public buildings. And precisely because they are public buildings, they need to have all the certification completed so that the public can have access to copies of the files or drawings to be satisfied that the building is being constructed as approved by the DCA and to standards. Now, the second thing is this. You will recall at the last sitting of Parliament, I wanted to find out about the company that is doing the cladding. I wanted to find out who the investors were. And you will notice that Guy Joseph skillfully skirted the issues that I raised and purported to give me information about the quality of the cladding. Whereas, I was interested in other things. I wanted to find out who this Trinidadian company was, how he got the contract, how that company got a contract to do the cladding. You are constructing a public building, and you have responsibility to make frank and full disclosure about all of these matters. You can't hide away these essential details from the public. And forget for a moment that the promises they made to the people of Beaufort and its other communities, nearby communities, they can't keep it. It's impossible to keep. And the tragedy is that this has worsened the situation of persons in the South, because had they completed the original hospital, then we would not have faced the kind of crisis we are now facing with COVID. And I guess the people of St. Lucia, and particularly the people of the South, will better understand what I tried to explain at the time, that constructing and outfitting a hospital was a timely and consuming matter. And now look at what the UWP has done. Has placed us in an even more precarious position. I don't think that hospital is going to be completed in a hurry. You can complete a shell by the end of the year, maybe, but then you have the problem of the installation of and equipment, and they're saying nothing about it. The amazing thing, as you rightly said, is that no one knows what is the full investment, how much the hospital is going to cost at the end of the day. And you're right to point out that $12 million will never ever complete the hospital in its current state. It's impossible. So it means that you either have to come by way of a supplementary budget or phase out the expenditure in such a way until, of course, you come back the following year. But clearly, you have a very unfortunate situation on our hands, and more mystery and more intrigue behind the construction of the hospital.
Because essentially what you have right now down in St. Jude is two incomplete structures. And in fact, the original structure, is actually far more advanced than what is currently being constructed. And I was looking at the just roughly to get a sense as to the scale and size of the new structure. It's about, I think, 170,000 square feet. And just by a rough estimation, you're more than likely talking about $170 million to be spent on that structure. And they've only thus far spent in the region of 70 million. So that just gives you a sense as to how much more money.
Absolutely, and it's how farcical it all is. And you will notice, of course, how lightly they have dismissed the issue of the completion date of the hospital. And we were constantly saying to the people of St. Lucia, Calix, that it's impossible to finish the hospital in the time frame that they had offered. And let me also say this, Calix. You know, this nonsense they keep on repeating, that the Labour Party had no plans for St. Jude Hospital. That's simply not true. When Guy Joseph stands in Parliament and makes statements to the media houses to suggest that there were no plans for the hospital in the SLP time, he is wrong. He's absolutely incorrect. Because there were plans submitted and site visits conducted by members of the DCA to verify plans as per the buildings on the ground. And I can say so categorically.
But
these plans are within the planning department.
Right.
And you can't take the risk of putting up such a building, Calix, without ensuring that you have satisfied all the planning requirements. Because if the issue of negligence arises, both the DCA and the government of St. Lucia will have to bear liability for what exists at this time. That's the reality that we face.
But there's another point there, Dr. Anthony, and it sometimes is missed by a number of people, that a statement like that from Mr. Guy Joseph is an indictment against himself, because the construction actually started under the King administration for that project.
It did, but I mean, I think the member for Castro Southeast, Guy Joseph, has taken this thing to extraordinary lengths. Instead, of course, leveling with the people of St. Lucia and dealing with the issue in a way that strips it of passion, but deal in it with a way, of course, that speaks the truth. I mean, I'm beginning to think, as I said to you, that the Development Control Authority is really afraid of Guy Joseph. You know, do you know that? I think there are plans to construct some kind of market just below the protective berm of the
of
Bexar.
Yes.
And there's supposed to be the construction of 2 HRDC buildings, one in Otsa and one next to the Bexar playing field.
Yes.
And the question is whether any approval has been given to those things, and why is the DCA allowing these activities to take place without obtaining the requisite approvals. The only conclusion I can come to is that, as I said, they are afraid of Guy Joseph.
Well, I think it's more than just Guy Joseph, because we've seen the same thing with the case of developments going on at Pigeon Point, where certain ministers apparently putting up structures. But maybe in that instance, I think that the DC has in fact stepped up. So maybe you're right. Maybe it is that it isn't only in that instance of Mr. Guy Joseph that he decided to step in.
But your colleagues, we are playing with fire. You people wonder why this society is so uncooperative and disobedient. Why there is so much tension in the country. Why is it that there's so much anger? When the people of the country see that you are treating certain individuals in a particular way, when the DCA, for example, harasses poor people in the country and goes after persons who have built properties on family land and insisting that they have plans, but yet they allow these activities involving public buildings to proceed with impunity, then how much confidence can you have? It goes back to what you're raising: fairness, balance, and equity. It's two different solutions.
And the Planning Act specifically state that it binds the Crown to all the rules.
Absolutely, the liability belongs to the Crown.
Yeah. Dr. Anthony, in the little time that we have, I know there's so much to discuss, but the rural economy, I know sometimes you consider yourself a country boy. Bananas.
No. I don't consider. I am a country boy, Calix. That's where I grew up.
Bananas. I mean, a lot has been done over the years. A lot has been said over the years about bananas. Your government invested a lot of money into bananas, $40 million to get the. I'm talking about this the SLBGA debts.
Yes,
money is into investing in IRDCs and irrigation systems and the history of the banana sector over the years is very, very well known, very well documented. And now we are at a situation right now where we're seeing the closure, effectively, the shutting down, bankruptcy of Winfresh. An institution which, of course, you would have been very instrumental in ensuring that was established for the exports, taking over geese.
I inherited it from the UWP government in 97.
Yes.
But, yes, I played a part in sustaining it.
But clearly, where we are at right now has to be perhaps the lowest dearth, the lowest level that bananas has ever been in this country.
I'll tell you, Calix, and I want to share two views with you. Firstly, this country has paid a heavy price, a brutal price, to the lies fed to the farmers of the country. The United Workers' Party has never been honest with banana farmers. Every election, they have misled them. And the farmers who have supported them has taken their arguments hook, line, and sinker. You recall when we lost the election in 2006, they promised that they would have returned the industry to its glory days. When we inherited the government in 2011, nothing had happened with bananas of any significance. In 2016, they promised them that they would have sold bananas to Martinique, and they had, to France. They had found this new market, and that the glory days again would return. Again, it never happened. It disappointed them, and that's a problem we have had. I have in the past suggested, Calix, that both governments perhaps come to some understanding regarding the future of the banana industry, because frankly, there are issues that need to be resolved. I mean, one of the issues, Calix, that we have not really spoken about is an immense destruction that occurred to the ecology of the island because of the banana industry.
Right.
And I'm not talking about just about deforestation. And I'm talking also about the pollution of our water table and the rivers. I'm not anti-bananas. All I'm saying is that we really should have been growing bananas in a certain way to protect the integrity of our environment and our inheritance, ecological inheritance. The question, though, Calix, is this: where do we go from here? I think there is place for the banana industry, but sad to say, we have to begin to explore new initiatives. I mean, there are some fascinating things that are occurring in Africa and elsewhere with the stems of bananas, and we now need to look at what is possible at an industrial level, what we can transform these byproducts into. And incidentally, I do think that certainly within the Caribbean, there's tremendous room for our export of bananas, and we have to continue to export bananas to the region. But it also means that we have to totally reconceptualize the production cycle of bananas and can't continue to produce bananas in the same way that we have over the years. So there is some room, but I think it has to be done within a redesigned approach to the agricultural sector. But I guess that's a discussion for another day.
Indeed. Dr. Kennedy Anthony, we're pretty much out of time here, but just to tease you a little bit regarding the date of the next general election. I think you're predicting somewhere between April and May, or early May, you said?
No, I think I suggested sometime in May, after the middle of May, towards the end of May. If the government is brave enough, possibly June, but I suspect towards the end of May. It is my understanding that somewhere in mid-April that we go to the House to discuss the budget policy statement, That would be an interesting exercise for both political parties, I think. And then once that occurs, then we have to begin to look to general election. There is obviously heightened activity on the ground. The UWP is busy now deploying canvassers, trying to persuade the St. Lucian people that after all they do care, never mind the massive expenditure in roads, but they care about them and their daily lives. We'll see what happens at the end of the day. But I think one important thing, Alex, is that the people of St. Lucia have had to endure so many lies. They have been misled so much. They are now much wiser for it all.
Well, if they do decide to go for May the 24th, 2021, it'll be about 24 years since your very famous election victory of 16-1 on May the 23rd,
Yes.
1997. So it'll be very interesting to see the result of the next general election. Dr. Kenny D. Anthony, thank you so very much
Alex.
for
It was
being
a pleasure to
our
talk to
guest
you.
here at the lunchroom.
I have to tell you, I had to adjust to the new arrangements of conducting an interview by telephone, but it didn't go too bad.
No, not too bad at all. And of course, you didn't have to worry about moving out of your office. So we thank you so
Absolutely.
Definitely. Thanks so very much for joining us.
My
and
pleasure.